Facebook just recently turned 17, and you know what that means.
Huh? Huh?
No, it means that it's the perfect time to talk about it so I can hopefully get that sweet, sweet algorithm bump.
I need the algorithm.
Depending on who you ask, opinions of Facebook generally fall into two camps. A generational defining and world-altering creation that has made it easier than it ever has before to stay in contact with another person and the rest of the world, or a time-wasting monopolistic skid mark on society that's run by a robot masquerading in a man costume who is slowly taking over the world and has ruined the idea of what it means to be friends with someone.
That is going on the ribs.
Sweet Baby Ray's.
Sweet Baby Ray's. Sweet Baby Ray's. Sweet Baby Ray's is very good.
Sweet Baby Ray's.
Sweet Baby Ray's. We have just applied the Sweet Baby Ray's. Sweet Baby Ray's. Sweet Baby Ray's. Maybe throw some Sweet Baby Ray's on the ribs and...
I'll give you a hint. It's both. Facebook remains one of the most controversial topics of public discussion that there is for numerous reasons, and has at this point become part of the lexicon of almost literally the entire world.
With that being said, and with us seemingly hurtling towards the metaverse faster than an independent fact check,
what could be better for an inaugural episode than to cover The Social Network? Based on the book The Accidental Billionaires by Ben Mesrick, this tells the story of the creation of Facebook, the actions and decisions made by the key players involved, and the ensuing lawsuits that followed in the wake. It's a story of ambition, class and social standing, friendship, jealousy, and ultimately betrayal. Oh, and lots of cool nerds doing, like cool nerd stuff.
It's slightly obnoxious that they only let you view one picture at a time, and there's no way I'm going to go to 500 pages to download pics one at a time, so it's definitely necessary to break out Emacs and modify that Perl script.
Exactly. Cool, but damn, that score sure can make anything sound thrilling. Moreover, this is the story of what happens when a gifted individual who feels destined for greatness and recognition is rejected or condescended to by those they wanted to be accepted by. It's a fantastic example of how sometimes greatness can be inspired by spite and the will to prove someone wrong, and the lengths that one will go to hold on to it once they have it. I saw this movie in theaters and fell in love with it immediately. Maybe there has always been a shade of cool nerd in me. But it is a very sharply written and brilliantly paced film with great performances throughout by everyone involved, and it's one I usually revisit once every year or two. This movie perfectly encapsulates that early 2010s feel and also weirdly sort of plays out the way the 2010s did as a whole for a lot of us. An exciting party at the beginning where all sorts of things feel like they could be possible before everyone's real feelings are revealed by the end and it all blows up and everyone's just pissed off at each other. But Facebook has nothing to do with that, right? That's right. No, let's not go down that rabbit hole, and instead, let's go down a bit of a different one. Because there are so many parallels to add context and really understand the creation of Facebook and social networking in general, we're going to start with a brief history of the humble beginnings of the internet as a whole before we catch up to our movie timeline to go over how close it got to what actually happened, as well as what happened after, and if the movie still holds up. Let's find out the real story behind the social network.
As scary as modern-day America feels at times, living in the late 50s and into the 60s had to have been one of the most turbulent and stressful periods in our country's history. Race relations had reached a boiling point as the Supreme Court had ruled school segregation to be unconstitutional in the landmark Brown v. Board of Education case. Also, the Civil Rights Act of 1957 had passed in September of that year, and while its only real achievement was the creation of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, which investigates claims of discrimination, it was the first piece of civil rights legislation since Reconstruction, so it was a big step in the right direction. However, this was a step that some people were not happy at all about taking. Also, the Cold War was in full swing at this point, and 1957 was a year of taking big L's for America. The Soviets successfully launched the world's first intercontinental ballistic missile, or ICBM, in August, followed by Earth's first ever satellite into space, Sputnik 1, on October 4th. This was the first major achievement of the space race. Their success really shifted the global opinion from a geopolitical standpoint, and it was beginning to look like the US was losing not only the Cold War, but their footing as the primary superpower of the day as well. In response to this in particular, President Eisenhower responded by creating the Advanced Research Projects Agency, or ARPA for short, in February of 1958. ARPA's key objectives were to research and develop cutting-edge innovations and inventions in the fields of science and technology. but more importantly, to make sure that America would no longer be finishing in second place when it came to anything regarding technological advancement. With NASA's creation later that year, however, ARPA began to phase out any work regarding anything to do really with space, and over the next 2 years completely transferring it along over with the majority of the rest of its budget as well. Their new directive would be targeted on basic research for high-risk, high-gain projects such as nuclear detection testing, and the program that would later come to be developed into what we know as GPS. One such project military commanders were looking for at the time was a computer communications system without a central core, or in other words, with no headquarters or base of operations that could be attacked and be destroyed by enemies, thus blacking out the entire network in one fell swoop. Say if, for instance, the Soviets decided to use their jet bombers and new toy ICBMs to launch surprise nuclear attacks all across the United States. By the 1960s, a system called SAGE, or Semi-Automatic Ground Environment, had already been built, and it used computers to track incoming enemy aircrafts as well as coordinate military responses. The system included 23 direction centers, each with a massive mainframe computer that could track up to 400 planes and distinguish friendly aircraft from enemy bombers. One of the earlier developers of the SAGE project was a computer scientist named Joseph Carl Robinette Licklider, or Lick for short. Imagine a nickname like Lick. Licklider had been serving as VP of Research and Development company Bolt, Beranek and Newman, and was hired as the first head of ARPA's Information Processing Techniques Office in 1962. Licklider's personal philosophy was that of interactive computing, or that a marriage of AI blended with human control was optimal and would make for a better world. This really did make him the perfect person for this sort of job, and although he was only in that position for 2 years, he is widely recognized as having laid the groundwork and also helping to fund many of the computer-based projects that ARPA would later go on to develop. His demilitarization of the department and focus switching more to the communications sector directly influenced the development of many things. Chiefly among them was an idea for the concept of an intergalactic network, where everyone on the globe could be connected and could access programs and data at any time from anywhere. Licklider detailed this vision in a paper called Intergalactic Computer Network, and showed it to a few colleagues that he had met along the way during his time at ARPA, whom he thought would maybe be good for the project. One of them was a computer scientist at NASA named Robert Taylor. Taylor had also read another article that Licklider had published in 1960 called Man-Computer Symbiosis. This work was an influential roadmap in the history of the internet and the personal computer, and it had greatly influenced Taylor. Taylor was hired at IPTO in 1965, and he was made the director a year later. At the time, one of the computer projects that ARPA supported was time-sharing, a program in which many users could work at terminals but share a single large computer. From his office at the Pentagon, Taylor had access to 3 teletype terminals, each hooked up to one of 3 remote ARPA-supported time-sharing mainframe computers. One at Systems Development Corps in Santa Monica, one at UC Berkeley's Genie project, and one at MIT's Compatible Time-Sharing System project. During his time monitoring these, he had made some key observations. Firstly, each of these separate networks, although cut off from each other, had developed an interactive community of users that were exchanging messages and sharing files with one another, helping to learn about each other in the process. Taylor also realized rather than having 3 separate terminals and 3 separate sets of commands, it would be much more efficient if they were all merged into one, with a single computer language protocol that could allow any terminal to communicate with any other terminal. His idea was to build a large computer network to connect the ARPA-sponsored projects together, if for nothing else, to let him communicate to all of them through one terminal to make his everyday job easier. Taylor went about convincing then ARPA director Charles M. Hersfeld to secure funding, which evidently he did not have trouble doing. Hersfeld was on the same page that this particular project's military role was much less important than correcting the issue that there was only a limited number of large, powerful research computers in the country, and many research investigators who should have access to them were geographically separated from them. But at the time this was launched, Hirschfeld noted, no one knew whether or not it could be done, so the move that he ultimately made, diverting $1 million away from ballistic missile defense, was very risky. Nonetheless, Taylor had his funding, and his next move would be trying to hire away engineer Larry Roberts from MIT Lincoln Laboratory to be its first program manager. Roberts had also been one of the people that Licklider had presented his initial idea to, and at first he resisted moving to Washington, D.C. That was until Charles Hirschfeld reminded the director of the Lincoln Laboratory that ARPA dominated its funding and it forced his hand.
I'm going to make him an offer he can't refuse.
JCR Licklider would continue to provide guidance, and Wesley A. Clark, the man credited with creating the first modern personal computer, also acted as a consultant. He suggested the use of a dedicated mini-computer called the Interface Message Processor at each node of the network instead of a centralized control like Larry Roberts' initial proposal, where all mainframe computers would connect to one another directly. This would be the first generation of gateways, or what we know today as routers. In the midst of all this, ARPA was completely unaware that a key piece of their puzzle was also taking shape in the form of research being done in the field of message switching, which was the primary method that was used to process telegrams at the time. With this technique, an entire message is transmitted without any break from one node to another. It firstly stores and then forwards information that requires more time. Due to this, the access time is increased and there is a greater chance for the lines to be occupied, thus creating log jams. Simultaneously, however, 3 different people were all coming up with the same revolutionary idea, that small clusters of digital information could be broken up from larger messages and could be trafficked or routed differently for expediency's sake. MIT grad student Leonard Kleinrock had written in his doctoral thesis on what he called queuing theory that would later be used in mathematical algorithms for said routing. Paul Barron, a researcher at the RAND Corporation think tank, was the first one to publish this idea, and his research on this in a 1964 paper. Barron had been instructed to come up with a plan for a computer communications network that could survive a nuclear attack and continue functioning. He came up with a process that he called hot potato routing, but unfortunately Barron's idea was ignored by the military at the time. Thousands of miles away, at Great Britain's National Physical Laboratory, English computer scientist Donald Davies was also coming to the same conclusions as Barron. His technique of dividing and routing a message into smaller packets of information he dubbed packet switching. A more modern demonstration of this would be an email might be split into numerous electronic packets of information and then transmitted almost at random across the labyrinth of the nation's telephone lines. They do not all follow the same route and don't even need to travel in proper sequential order. They are precisely reassembled at the modem's receiver's end, and because each packet contains an identifying header revealing each part of the larger message it represents, along with instructions for reconstituting the intended message, it always acts as a failsafe to make sure that things get reconstructed properly. Data packets make computer communications more workable within existing telephone infrastructure by allowing all those packets to flow following paths of least resistance, thereby preventing those aforementioned log jams of digital data over direct dedicated telephone lines. Davies' research would be presented by a colleague at the 1967 Symposium on Operating Systems Principles and would catch the attention of Larry Roberts. Roberts had been there to present Wesley Clark's idea on IMPs, and a working relationship was developed to bring packet switching formally into the ARPANET's design. Shortly after, Paul Barron's 1964 paper was found collecting dust in the offices of ARPA, and he was brought on in a consulting role as well. A request for quote would be placed for the development of the network, and it would be JCR Licklider's former employer Bolt, Beranek, and Newman who would win the $1 million contract and bid in 1968. Well, wouldn't you know who won the pony? The 4 IMPs were then built and shipped to UCLA, Stanford Research Institute, University of California, Santa Barbara, and the University of Utah School of Computing. And over the closing months of 1969, the initial Ford-node network was established. It is worth noting, though, that it was not a rousing start. As UCLA tried logging into the Stanford Research Institute's computer for the first time, the system crashed just as they were typing the letter G in login. The second attempt did work, however, and soon all of the bugs were worked out and more connections are made. increasing the network size to 63 hosts by 1976. During its first 10 years, ARPANET was a testbed for networking innovations, producing all sorts of new features. I mentioned email earlier, and it is through the ARPANET that the first email is created in 1971 by programmer Ray Tomlinson, being the technical starting point of social networking. To hear him describe it, though, is just fucking awesome.
It seemed like a neat idea. Nobody was clamoring for email. I mean, there's nobody, our sponsor, Department of Defense, didn't say anything about wanting email. My boss didn't say anything about email. But in fact, nobody said anything about email because the term wasn't coined until several years later. But it just seemed like an interesting thing to do with a computer and a network. And so I just did it.
So basically, this guy was just messing around in his spare time and thought it would be fun to make this amazing innovation that nearly everyone has now, and all these things just made sense to him. I love just how uninterested he is in how big of a deal this was. Although the ARPANET may have started out as a research project that was communications/information oriented, it was obvious the type of potential this had for militaristic use, and by the summer of 1975, the ARPANET was declared operational and the Defense Communications Agency took control. By that time, it was no longer experimental, nor was it alone. Numerous new networks had emerged by the late 1970s, including CSNet, or the Computer Science Research Network, CDNet, or the Canadian Network, BitNet, or Because It's Time Network, SatNet, the satellite network, and the AlohaNet, which was a packet radio system based in Hawaii. It was at this point that one of the ARPANET's key limitations would begin to rear its ugly head, because one of the things it could not do was talk to any of these other computing networks. Its design required too much control and too much standardization among machines and equipment on the network. This problem would be tackled by electrical engineer Bob Kahn, who had been recently hired by Larry Roberts away from BBN. He would enlist the help of Stanford professor Vinton Cerf, and together they would develop a new computer communications protocol, or a gateway between all of these networks. This would eventually become known as Transmission Control Protocol Internet Protocol, or TCP/IP, and would first be tested on ARPANET in 1977. The way it worked is one network could hand off data packets to another, then another, and then another. Eventually, when the internet consisted of a network of networks, these innovations would prove invaluable as they remain the basis of how the modern internet works. In 1983, ARPANET was divided into two parts: MILNET, to be used by military and defense agencies, and a civilian version of the ARPANET. The word Internet was initially coined as an easy way to refer to the combination of these two networks in their internetworking. However, in 1985, the National Science Foundation funded the establishment of national supercomputing centers at several universities that provided network access and network interconnectivity. Called the NSFNet, it became the internet backbone for government agencies and universities. The National Science Foundation permitted only government agencies and universities to use this network until 1989, at which point the first commercial internet service provider emerged. ARPANET's importance would then diminish further and further until the system was formally decommissioned in 1990. By 1991, the NSF removed restrictions on access, and the commercial ISP business grew rapidly, and it would only be a year before British computer scientist Tim Berners-Lee would change everything all over again with the introduction of the World Wide Web that we use today. As anyone alive in the 90s can attest to, the internet changed absolutely everything, and slowly began working its way into nearly every facet of our lives, from business to news and information to entertainment, and the reason that we're all here, socially. In the internet's early days, Yahoo would give us GeoCities, which, if you aren't old enough to remember, was basically a place where anyone could make their own website based on a certain theme or topic, and also browse sites created by other people. America Online would follow with its instant messenger service, or as it was known back then, AIM. AIM would become the de facto messaging service for millions of users and would become the precursor to modern-day texting and messaging. The ability to create a user profile was an incredibly innovative thing at the time, and AIM would also inspire Facebook's creators with its away status that users would frequently use to have a clever saying or quote to serve as an automatic reply message when they weren't online. This would be the inspiration for The Wall that Facebook would later adopt, that would eventually become Newsfeed, that is its current form. Other sites would follow suit, creating social networking sites such as 6 Degrees, Classmates, Frenzy, and High Five, just to name a few. Many of these were dating sites, with lots of them ending up more just niche driven. For example, Classmates allowed users to reconnect with old classmates, pals, bullies, and crushes, and it was a hit immediately. However, the first modern social networking site as we know them today was launched in March 2003, and it would be called Friendster. It used the degree of separation concept similar to what 6 Degrees had, but theirs was dubbed Circle of Friends. It was basically a dating site like those before it, but it combined the user profile aspects of AIM, and it allowed you to build a network of friends and possibly meet new people based off of who your friends knew. Due to this, it was fairly popular amongst college students, including having initially garnered a large following at Harvard. In the first few months, it had been able to amass 3 million users, and one of those users was a young freshman computer science major named Mark Zuckerberg. Being still technically in its beta test phase, Friendster was bogged by serious technical problems, though, that would cause it to lose that goodwill it had built by annoying its users with freezing logins that would sometimes take up to a minute to load, as well as crashing servers. Zuckerberg noticed this as well, and Friendster's popularity started to wane across Harvard, and he made note of this importance of the ability to handle growth on a technical level as far as server capabilities. Friendster also suffered from bad business decisions as well, as its creator, Canadian computer programmer Jonathan Abrams, had turned down an offer of $30 million from Google to buy the site, and instead decided to go into business with venture capital firms Kleiner Perkins, Caulfield and Byers, and Benchmark Capital in October of 2003. A new board of directors was established, with Abrams made as CEO. The decision to stay private instead of selling to Google is considered still one of the biggest blunders in Silicon Valley history, because in April 2004, John Abrams was voted out as CEO, with the reasons given being that Abrams was spending more time partying than fixing Friendster's numerous problems. You'll notice that this is a bit of a common story in the Valley. Friendster would try and expand internationally far beyond its reach at the time, and would lose ground in the US, eventually shutting down its services permanently in 2015 after a brief rebirth in some Southeast Asian countries. Another site named MySpace would launch later that year in August. Their site was created by a company named Entertainment Universe Inc. that had seen the potential of Friendster and essentially cloned its main features using a program called Cold Fusion, creating it in 10 days. MySpace, however, had much more customization available in terms of building a profile, with the ability to add songs that would play when a person visited your page, custom page backdrops, videos, and much more. According to Mark Zuckerberg, MySpace had not really gained any traction at Harvard, though, which I can believe, as I think most Ivy League students would likely see MySpace as too high schoolish for them. I, for one, love MySpace, which I guess makes sense being as that I was in high school at the time, but honestly, it kicked ass. And everyone knows the best way to show someone how important they really are to you is by literally ranking them. Evidently, I was not alone, as MySpace exploded in popularity, eventually overtaking Friendster in early 2004 as the #1 social media site in the US. And then the legend of Tom was born. This brings us to fall of 2003 and the beginning of our film. Now, before we start judging the accuracy of this, context is king, and it's worth noting some surrounding the creating of its source material, The Accidental Billionaires. At the time, its writer Ben Mesrick had recently written a book called Bringing Down the House that was later adapted into the movie 21. Ooh, was that a potential future episode name drop, or am I just bluffing? Anyway, Mesrick is contacted by a mysterious person claiming to know who actually invented Facebook, and no one had ever heard of him. Intrigued, Mesrick agreed to meet, and this would be the first time that he would meet Eduardo Saverin. Eduardo spun a very glitzy and scandalous tale of the events surrounding Facebook's creation, and these stories would become the basis for this book. However, at some point, Eduardo goes radio silent on Ben Mesrick, and soon it becomes apparent as to why. Eduardo had been cleverly using this as a chess piece move in an effort to put pressure on Mark to settle their ongoing lawsuit. It must have worked because shortly after, Mark did settle, and part of the agreement was that Eduardo could no longer have any more contact with Ben Mesrick, which is why Mesrick is clear to mention in the book's foreword that some of these scenes are completely reimagined or created to fill in some gaps. Ben Mesrick would also consult the Winklevi twins and Sean Parker as well after Eduardo left him on red, but the Zuck would not give Mesrick any time of day. So the book and the movie sort of plays out like one side of a two-sided story. Or, I guess, two sides of a three-sided story, or possibly if you concede that the truth is a separate side of every story, then it could be. Anyway, the point is that it's not the whole story. As a companion piece, I would recommend reading The Facebook Effect by David Kirkpatrick, since this book did have the cooperation of Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg. This being the case, it reads like Mark's side of the story, so my strategy for this is to kind of compare the events of the two source materials and what has also come out since in the public eye to paint a clearer picture of what actually took place. So when the movie opens up, Mark has already returned for his sophomore year at Harvard, and we're in a college bar where he gets into an argument with Rooney Mara about how awful she was in the Nightmare on Elm Street remake. Or at least I guess that's what I would be arguing with her about. No, in all seriousness, we're showing a conversation take place between Mark and the girl he's dating named Erica regarding the difficult prospect of standing out when the field is full of nothing but exceptional candidates. A brief explainer on the importance of Harvard's final clubs in terms of social standing, which comes more into play later, and an interesting amount of time spent on rowing crew, which I'm assuming is done because most people don't know what that is, and it's going to be a big thing mentioned, possibly too much, later in the story. What I love about this conversation is the way David Fincher shot, directed, and edited it to end up almost sounding the way a comments section does sometimes on Facebook, the two talking nearly simultaneously and holding up multiple threads of the same discussion.
There are really more people in China with genius IQs than the
The
entire
Phoenix is the
population.
most diverse. The Fly Club, Roosevelt punched the pork.
Which one?
The Porcellian, the pork, it's the best of the best.
Which Roosevelt?
Theodore. And you asked me which one was the easiest one.
I was honestly just asking, okay? I was just asking to ask. Mark, I'm not speaking in code.
Erica.
You're obsessed with finals clubs. You have finals clubs OCD and you need to see someone about it who will prescribe you some sort of medication. You don't care if the side effects may include blindness.
Final clubs, not finals clubs. And there's a difference between being obsessed and being motivated.
Yes, there is.
And who doesn't love the pipe bombs dropped on Mark by Erica after she breaks up with him for insulting her?
You are probably going to be a very successful computer person. But you're going to go through life thinking that girls don't like you because you're a nerd. And I want you to know from the bottom of my heart that that won't be true. It'll be because you're an asshole.
Now, we don't know the exact conversation that took place that night, and Erica Albright is a fictional character, so her appearances and references later in the movie are purely a Hollywood addition. But we do know that on that night, Mark stormed back to his Kirkland Hall dorm and proceeded to get drunk and blog, "Jessica Alona is a bitch. I need to think of something to take my mind off her." And this something would develop into Face Mash, a hot or not style site comparing pictures of two Harvard students and inviting the user to click on who was more attractive. Mark mused drunkenly on his blog about the sorry state of some of the photos on Kirkland's Facebook and joked about comparing some of them to farm animals, which would get him in trouble later. This, along with the quote used on the home page, set the tone for the site right off the bat. Were we let in for our looks? No. Will we be judged by them? Yes. He obtained most of the photos for the site the way we were shown, by hacking 9 of the 12 different houses at Harvard's Facebooks. At the time, a Facebook was simply a directory page of sorts for all of the different dorm halls at Harvard. These would have very basic info about a person living there, as well as a usually awkward school picture-looking photo of the person. For those houses he could not hack, Mark got creative, getting one of his friends at Lowell House to temporarily allow him access to the house's Facebook. And in another, he would sneak into the hall itself and hijack their Ethernet connection. Why they did not put this in the movie, I have no idea, because I feel like it would have added to the moment. But nonetheless, the pictures were obtained and the site was created all in the span of one night. The link was sent to a couple of people, but soon snowballed as the site proved to be very popular. Now, the 22,000 hits number in the movie is true, but it is a bit misleading, as that traffic came from an estimated 450 users, and each of the 22,000 hits was an individual vote. It also did not all come crashing in during the first couple hours of the site being live the way it is shown in the movie. Rather, it grew over the course of the next day, and by 10 p.m. the following night, when Mark returned to his dorm from a meeting he had been at, Harvard's network had indeed crashed as a result of the site's growing popularity and use.
What happened next is pretty close to what is explained and shown in the movie. Several of Harvard's women's groups became aware of the site and were understandably furious at what they saw as a misogynistic place for ranking women. It is worth noting, however, that Face Smash did have a section that was also for ranking men as well that is never shown in the movie. A story is told in the Facebook effect of a gay student at Harvard who was elated when he had discovered that he was the top-ranked photo amongst the male section and promptly told his friends, which directed them to join the site as well. I don't give that as a comment on the validity of how those women at Harvard felt about the site. They were/are perfectly justified for feeling however about it. I just thought it was an interesting find from my research. In any event, the backlash from the site as well as the perceived code of conduct/privacy violations were enough to land Mark in hot water with Harvard's ad board, and he was brought before them like we see in the movie. Mark was not alone, however, as he was joined by the student at Lowell House who had given him his internet access, his roommate Billy Olson, the one he mentions in his blog gave him the idea for the farm animals, and another student who had lived in Kirkland who was seen as having assisted Mark with the site. The meeting doesn't appear to have been nearly as contentious as we were shown, and Mark mostly apologized and claimed that he had not intended the site to reach the public yet, and that he had only sent it to a few friends as a test pilot of sorts. He also noted that he apologized in the Crimson to the various women's groups for any perceived offenses, and would even later go on to mend fences with the Association of Harvard Black Women by helping them to create their website. However, if you'd like a slight comparison of how I believe this meeting might have gone, then I would point you to Mark's testimony to Congress in 2018 to show that he does have that ability in real life to kind of be a dick, but in the way that you know he's right.
Do you track devices that an individual who uses Facebook has that is connected to the device that they use for their Facebook connection, but not necessarily connected to Facebook?
I'm not sure the answer to that question.
Really?
Yes.
You commit to changing all the user default settings to minimize to the greatest extent possible the collection and use of users' data.
Congressman, this is a complex issue that I think deserves more than a one-word answer.
Well, again, that's disappointing.
How long do we have to wait for that kind of investigation?
Congresswoman, we expect it to take many months.
Years?
I hope not.
How do you sustain a business model in which users don't pay for your service?
Senator, we run ads.
Mark was given academic probation and assigned to see a counselor. The others were let go without punishment. All of this is reported in the Crimson, and this gets the attention of senior Divya Narendra, who then goes to his business partners, Cameron and Tyler Winklevoss. Divya and the Winklevoss twins had been developing an idea that they called the Harvard Connection, a dating site that would be exclusive to those with a harvard.edu email address. This site would aim to help busy students such as the Winklevoss twins, whose lives were too dominated by class and extracurriculars to make any romantic connections that they otherwise might have not had time to make. The three had been having trouble getting the site built though, as they had lost a couple of programmers due to other gigs. However, they all agreed that Mark was the exact person they needed to bring on board to bring this venture to life. The initial meeting with them and Mark is not how it is portrayed in the movie, however. Divya reached out to Mark via email, and the twins would meet him in Kirkland Dining Hall rather than the bike room in the Porcellian Club. My guess is this was done to illustrate the prestige of this particular final club and to serve as a better environment for the exposition dump that we're given in this scene. The little bit about not being allowed past the bike room unless you're a member is absolutely true, and the only exception to this rule is for one night only on a member's wedding night. He is allowed to bring his bride past for a tour of the building. And I assume then assert ownership of his new wife by banging her in an upstairs bedroom and making her do the walk of shame one last time for old time's sake.
I'm gonna put my dick in. I'm gonna put my dick in.
Anyhow, this is also where we are told some of Mark's accomplishments in previous other ventures, such as the MP3 software program called Synapse that read a person's taste in music and recommended songs to them based on the info received. He had developed this as a senior project with his good friend Adam D'Angelo while he was still in high school at Exeter Academy in New York, and he really did turn down Microsoft's attempts to buy it for $1 million. Which is mind-blowing to me that a high school kid would turn down $1 million, but it really does give us an important insight as to who Mark is as a person, and it explains some of his decisions made later, in that nothing is ever simply about the money for him. We're also briefly told about Course Match, which Mark had developed his first week of sophomore year at Harvard as a way to help determine classes to choose based on what classes your friends or possible romantic interests were also taking. Mark agrees to build the site, but is always very careful if he talks about this now to make it known that he had lots of projects going on, none of which he was solely committed to. We have some scenes of the dual litigations that act as the movie's framing device, and we'll talk more about those later, but first I want to cover what happened next. As we are shown, this is when Mark goes and pitches his idea for what would become Facebook to Eduardo.
It was called The Facebook then.
Now, what happens in the movie is a little bit different from how it happened in real life, as some timing and sequence of events have been changed to add more narrative complexity to Mark and Eduardo's relationship. For instance, the Caribbean night party where Eduardo is giving his talk about the relationship between Jewish guys and Asian girls is not where Mark pitched the idea. This party did happen, but it happened earlier in the year, and it's really where their friendship sort of began. Eduardo was a year older than Mark, but both were members of Alpha Epsilon Pi, Harvard's Jewish fraternity. There's a far bigger change made that needs to be mentioned, though, because it becomes a somewhat significant plot point later, and this is the dynamic surrounding each of their attempts to get into a final club. I mentioned Harvard's final clubs earlier, and they're brought up several times during the movie. These are basically Harvard's versions of secret societies that exist on other Ivy League campuses that very much drive social life there. Each of these clubs has a different reputation and standing. For instance, the Porcellian, which is the club the Winklevoss twins belonged to, was the most prestigious, as its members were generally seen as the next leaders of the world. The Phoenix, however, is seen as the biggest party club, and because of this, it is highly sought after amongst your average Harvard student. This is evident by the fact that only 20 members are chosen every year out of as many as 200 candidates. The party scenes we see while Mark is building Face Mash are implied to be the Phoenix Club, and they really do send a bus around to the other New England campuses in the area to pick up girls to party with, and this is known as the fuck truck, because of course it is. Now, we are led to believe that Mark is still trying to figure out a way to stand out enough to be selected by one of these clubs, and even scoffs a bit at the prospect of Eduardo gaining entry, but then is forced to watch as Eduardo effortlessly makes his way through the cuts and is ultimately selected. But that's just not how it happened. Mark did attempt to pledge for the Phoenix his sophomore year, and even though he did have some name recognition from Course Match, he was really not the type of person these clubs really went after, being that he was seen as kind of a computer nerd, so he was not selected. Eduardo, on the other hand, who was a Brazilian immigrant and the son of a wealthy businessman, was exactly the type of person they were looking for. It also didn't hurt that they thought he ran a hedge fund, which he was in no hurry to correct. This being the case, Eduardo made his way through the cut process, and he was actually through 3 of the 4 cuts when he and Mark first became friends. Mark likely saw Eduardo as his ticket to gaining entry himself the following year, rather than any sort of jealousy that is possibly implied during the mediation scenes. But it makes for a far more dramatic story, I guess. Also, I think they switch around the timing of things to add more ambiguity to the notion of whether Mark actually stole the Winklevoss twins' idea and went straight to Eduardo with it. Which brings us to the first of the big questions this movie really wants you to ask yourself. Did Mark, in fact, steal the idea? And the answer is no. One only has to look at Mark's history to determine that he was connecting the dots of creating what would become Facebook long before he met the Winklevoss twins. Synapse, Course Match, and Face Mash had all played a pivotal role and provided an insight that would later be adopted into Facebook, or be used as a cautionary tale to avoid a previous mistake. The same could be said of Friendster, as it showed the potential of what this industry could be, but also the pitfalls of not being properly prepared from a technical standpoint for sustained growth. Another thing that played a huge role, and that is not mentioned in the movie, is the inspiration Mark drew from his relationship with his high school friend from Exeter, Adam D'Angelo. D'Angelo had pioneered another project in the summer called BuddyZoo, which was a tool that used your AIM buddy list and compared it to all of your friends that had the same program, and if they did, they would be listed as your buddy. It was popular, but Adam didn't really try to commercialize it, so it faded to obscurity, which seems to be a strangely similar tale in this industry of brilliant people being wholly unimpressed by their genius. However, this would really be the first display of how important showing off your social list would become, and would sort of be the precursor to the friend collectors that we know now on Facebook. This would also inspire the mutual friends and people you may know features that we know today. So as you can see, really Facebook could be described as the final form of all of Mark's other projects and information that he had taken note of. If anything that could be said was a borrowed concept from the Winklevoss' idea, was the exclusivity that a harvard.edu email address brought. And while Mark does concede that exclusivity was a factor in the initial growth, Perhaps even a bigger factor was, at the time on Facebook, you had to be invited by a friend to join, which was huge in verifying that a person was who they said they were. Now, if you've ever sold anything on Marketplace, or you've ever been scammed into giving someone your phone number so they end up opening a Google phone account, you know that feature's train has long since sailed. However, at the time, this was a huge deal, as MySpace would later find out the hard way and would cost them big in the long run, helping attribute to their downfall. What Mark is guilty of, however, is stonewalling the Harvard connection and leading Divya and the Winklevoss twins on as if he was completing their site, when in reality he was putting the pieces together of his own idea. We are shown a montage of Mark's emails and attempts to stall, but it is left a bit open-ended because at the time, all we really could do was theorize about Mark's intentions. That was until 2014, when messages surfaced between Mark and Eduardo that indeed prove he was intentionally sabotaging them. It is at this point, when they come back from winter break, that Mark pitches the idea to Eduardo to cover the startup costs in exchange for 30% of the company. TheFacebook.com would officially launch on February 4th, 2004, and with a little help from Eduardo's membership to the Phoenix and the access it gave, it would absolutely take Harvard by storm, gaining 650 members in its first 3 days, making Mark an overnight celebrity, or as Divya puts it in the movie,
and Mark was the biggest thing on the campus. It included 19 Nobel laureates, 15 Pulitzer Prize winners, 2 future Olympians, and a movie star.
Who's the movie star?
Doesn't matter.
It did to me. It was Natalie Portman, by the way. Anyway, another interesting aspect that probably led to some of Facebook's initial success was the timing of which Mark launched the site. You see, the first week of February at Harvard is typically known as shopping week, where classes can be added or dropped at will. Facebook had the same course searching technology that CourseMatch had, so this really did provide a perfect scenario where function was at its peak. It didn't take too long for word to get back to Divya and the Winklevoss twins, though, what Mark had done, and they immediately drafted a cease and desist letter. We get a snippet of a speech given by Bill Gates at Harvard, which did occur, but it is painted in The Accidental Billionaires as the moment that inspired Mark to drop out of Harvard, which, according to sources, is just not accurate. We also get some bathroom BJs.
Sweet.
But these likely didn't happen, as Mark was dating his current wife Priscilla Chan by this point. We also get another convo with Rooney Mara about her awful Nancy performance, and it is when she puts Mark in check here that we are led to believe is the catalyst for Mark's wanting to expand to Yale and Columbia.
And Stanford.
What?
Stanford. It's time for them to see this in Palo Alto.
Why Stanford? Why do you think?
Well, I'll tell you exactly the reason why, Div. It's because the intent was always to expand to other Ivy League schools, and these ones were the first ones targeted because each one already had a burgeoning social media program similar to what Facebook was trying to accomplish. Mark figured that testing his new project in a trial-by-fire situation against real competition would show what kind of legs this thing really had. This is also the scene where we get the first glimpse of the changing dynamic in terms of Mark and Eduardo's differing opinions on monetizing the site. They get the dynamic largely right, and it's easy to see both of their points of view, honestly. Eduardo did want to monetize the site, and even though Mark was not quite as insistent on no advertisers at first, Mark had always been more interested about making something cool, and so Eduardo feared he would never put any importance on the monetization side of things. And for good reason. We are talking about the guy who turned down $1 million as a high school kid. It's not hard to see Mark's thought process as well, though, because the Facebook was cool, and in the social media industry, coolness is a priceless commodity. Also, at the time, sites like Craigslist and Wikipedia had shown to be very successful with their anti-big donor model of business, and this had all the makings of the same thing. In any event, though, it is the expansion to Stanford that gives us our first introduction to Sean Parker. In the movie, Sean stumbles upon Facebook after a one-night stand with a Stanford student majoring in trombone.
I remember something about a trombone.
Ugh, I hope you're gonna brush your teeth while you're at it, girl. In real life, though, he came across it on his roommate's girlfriend's computer and knew he had come across the next big thing that he had to be involved in. Now, this was a bit of a pivotal point in Sean's life, as it is touched on a bit in the movie. Sean had had many legal issues with the music industry during his role in co-founding Napster. He had also been ousted at the online Rolodex company he had started called Plaxo in April of 2004, the same month he has the initial meetings with Mark and Eduardo in New York. Now, I haven't been able to confirm whether this was before or after he was ousted, but the movie says after, so we'll go with that. The story behind his ousting at Plaxo is a familiar one as well. Sean had gone into business with venture capital firm Sequoia and its CEO, Michael Moritz, and he would quickly run afoul of them with his unreliability and frequent partying that would soon see him voted out of his own company. Now, these names are changed in the movie to Case Equity and Mitchell Manningham, which I'm guessing was done to avoid a possible lawsuit, but it is a bit weird considering they mention Peter Thiel and his hedge fund Clarion Capital by name later when Mark is introduced by Sean to them. Speaking of Peter Thiel, it's worth noting that Sean had made some contacts at Friendster and he had gotten Thiel involved with them as well, but it was a bit too late to save them from the technical issues that had already set in. This shows just how much Sean was aware of how big the potential was with this once-in-a-generation holy shit idea, as he calls it, and that he understood the importance of landing at the ground floor of the company who would get this right. His method of attaining the initial meeting is pretty interesting as well. According to David Kirkpatrick in The Facebook Effect, he would email Mark and offer to introduce them to Silicon Valley CEOs that he was acquainted with at LinkedIn and at Tribe. He claimed that they had purchased a patent on a new thing that would be of vital importance for social networking and thought that it might be beneficial for the Facebook, and so that it was not potentially used against them in the future as well. This leads to the New York meeting we see in the movie, and they get the initial dynamic between Eduardo and Sean correct, as Sean and Mark hit it off right away and almost pretended as if Eduardo was not even there, and Eduardo thought Sean was a bit of a snake oil salesman. According to Eduardo, Sean was also very insistent on one thing.
Drop the. Just Facebook. It's clean.
But this apparently wouldn't take place until later, not at the initial meeting. It's implied here that Sean sort of coerced Mark to come out to California as well, but in reality there were several other reasons that played much more of a factor. But we'll get back to those in a minute. First, I want to quickly touch on what we get next with the bit during Eduardo and Mark's mediation about Eduardo being accused of animal cruelty while pledging for the Phoenix. Now, the reasoning for this is changed in the movie, as the article outlining the charges paints a picture of prospective members being forced to torture and kill chickens as part of an initiation. But I understand why they changed that. It's implied at different points in the movie also as to who could have been the person that tipped off the Crimson about this. At one point, it's the Winklevoss twins, and at one point later, it's Mark. However, neither of these are true, as it was likely a prank pulled by some of the other Porcellian members against the Phoenix. We also get the intern hiring scene next. Now, Ben Mesrick admits this is a reimagined scene written by him from some snippets given to him by Eduardo, but to be honest, it doesn't seem like it would be far off from something that could be plausible. However, according to Dustin Moskovitz, it is a ridiculously caricatured version of what actually happened. Speaking of Dustin Moskovitz, let's talk about him as well, and this is really the kind of start of a section that we're going to call missed opportunities for this movie, because there are several of them that we're about to go through. Now, some of them are not the fault of the writers and the filmmakers, as it was too late to add certain information, but some of them are less than ideal choices for certain scenes that they definitely had access to the information to. One of them is Dustin Moskovitz's role in the early days of Facebook. Now, in the movie, he's little more than a side character with just a few lines here and there and a minor presence throughout the movie. In reality, Dustin played a critical role in the expansion to new schools, as it was his job to set up the registration procedure and do all the logistical work to add each one to the system, each one taking about a day and a half to add. He was also not the gifted programmer that the movie made him out to be, but really someone that was just a hard worker and kept at the grind and was willing to learn. Another of these missed opportunities lies in the real reasons that Mark wanted to go to California, like we touched on earlier. Now, part of it was because Silicon Valley was always like the promised land to Mark, as it was where many of these tech legends had forged their beginnings. But a bigger reason is because Mark's old buddy from Exeter, Adam D'Angelo, had gotten an internship at EA in California and had come on in an official capacity earlier in the year. He would play a big role in helping Moskovitz with the technical side of adding new schools to the site, but also Mark had begun work on a separate project that is not mentioned in the movies, and he wanted D'Angelo on it with him. This project was called Wirehog, and it was essentially a mix of Facebook and Napster, in that it was a peer-to-peer sharing service that would allow users not only to exchange music, but also video and text files or any kind of digital information with approved friends on their list. He had conceived this with another friend from Harvard named Andrew McCullum, who would later go on to become CEO of Philo. Wirehog would go on to become something that could have probably tanked Facebook had it not been averted, but I'll come back to that at the right time. The point is, it's easy to see why Mark wanted to go to California.
I can also see where Eduardo is coming from on his end though as well, and his worry that he expresses in the movie is genuinely possibly somewhat rightly founded, because Mark and Eduardo had venture capitalist representatives and major software reps approaching them on campus all through spring semester that previous year, making them offers, but none really throwing out real money. Eduardo was worried that this possibly would happen to Mark while he was out in Cali, and Eduardo would not be there for those part of the discussions. His decision to stay in New York also did make some sense as well, as he had landed a pretty good internship at a prestigious New York investment bank that could end up lending itself some nice contacts. The site was also having to deal with rising server costs, and Eduardo was dealing with the pressure from his dad, a successful businessman, to take this position as Facebook was not making any real money yet. The situation may not have been ideal for them to be parted, but Eduardo figured that it was only temporary and Mark would be back in the fall. Once Mark is out in California, he links back up with Sean Parker, but it's portrayed slightly differently in the movie. In reality, Sean's lease had been up and he was forced to move into his current girlfriend's parents' house. Mark, Dustin, and the interns had been on their way walking back from the local grocery store when they stumbled upon Sean moving things into the house. Coincidentally, these houses were not far apart, and this meeting would prove to be fortuitous, as Sean would also receive some bad news from his lawyer while out with Mark and the rest of the gang that night at a restaurant. You see, he was still in the midst of his battle with the board at Plaxo, and they had voted to not allow half of his shares in the company to vest. Or, in other words, he was not only getting booted out of the company, but he was also losing any chance to make anything should the company be sold or go public later on down the line. This would be the thing that would lead to Sean moving in and taking a position with Facebook and altering the course of its history. But hey, at least we get the zip line and the Victoria's Secret models in the club, right? But let's move on to one of the bigger missed opportunities in my opinion, and this is one of the ones that falls squarely on the hands of the filmmakers because the information was there and they just picked wrong and missed an awesome detail. It's at this point we see Cameron and Tyler losing to the Dutch in the Royal Regatta race.
Brutally excruciating.
Now, this did happen, and it's the moment that the movie uses as the catalyst to end the hesitation to pursue Mark in federal court when they find out that Facebook has begun to expand internationally. In real life, though, the Winklevi had been hesitant to pursue it because they were very aware of the optics of how two massive jocks who were about to become Olympians accusing a computer nerd of stealing their idea looked. Or, as they put it,
my brother and I are in skeleton costumes chasing the Karate Kid around a high school gym.
I think a better placement for this moment, however, would have been another scene described in The Accidental Billionaires, and it's something that's briefly mentioned earlier in the movie. It's when Cameron and Tyler are meeting with the dean of Harvard, and they're mentioning that they had rebranded their site to be ConnectU and had proceeded on with the launch. However, it's described by all of them as an absolutely bitter moment as they launched what they knew was an incredible idea and that they all thought rightfully belonged to them, but that they were just late in doing. The book describes Divya as trying to make it seem as like a big deal, as if they really had a chance to compete and to project as much excitement as possible, but in reality they all knew what this was. I think this would have been a much better moment to serve as the final straw that broke the camel's back, in that we're going to finally sue this mother. Speaking of ConnectU, a funny story I came across during my research happened right after the launch of the site, as apparently Mark hacked into the site and created a fake profile for Cameron Winklevoss, which was, let's just say, less than flattering. The next thing you see in the movie is Eduardo arriving in California after having been left on the tarmac in the rain by Mark to find Sean living in the house with the team. We're led to believe that Eduardo had no idea of Sean's involvement up to this point, but in reality, Eduardo knew that Sean had been living there, and he was never left at the airport. This scene is used, however, to escalate tensions between Eduardo and Sean and to grow the divide between him and Mark. We also see Eduardo freeze the accounts next to get everyone in California's attention, but this is missing a good bit of context. What really happened is best described, in my opinion, as Sean becoming clearly the better person suited to run the business end of things, and Eduardo holding his ground / letting his jealousy get the best of him. Sean would get the company in contact with a lawyer and begin lining up potential investors, but to do so, the company would need to be restructured. Even though Eduardo had been having small success in New York, there was no real money coming in yet, and it was becoming obvious he was not capable of securing the types of things that would be needed to handle Facebook's growth. He was also becoming increasingly hard to reach or make decisions without the input of his father. Eduardo received paperwork from the lawyer on the intent to reincorporate the company to Delaware instead of the Florida LLC that he had set up. This would be done in order to bring on new investors that Sean had potentially lined up. Florida was where Eduardo's family lived and had been the reason he had chose there for the LLC. However, Delaware has always been much more corporate friendly, and many companies choose to incorporate there because of the tax benefits. From Eduardo's standpoint, he had put in all of the money up to that point, and Mark appeared not all that interested in making a profit anytime soon. He also saw Sean as not having any right to be making any sort of business decisions, since according to him, he was the sole business end of the company. Because of this, in mid-July of 2004, he went and drafted a letter re-outlining his position and informed them that he would be using his position as 30% owner to block the Facebook from taking on any more potential investors until formal papers were signed, essentially forcing the guys in Palo Alto to kiss the ring. When Mark did not respond in kind, Eduardo froze the accounts, and this move all but sealed his fate, as this was sacrilege to Mark. Without the money in the account to sustain servers and expenses, Facebook would soon crash and suffer the same fate as all those before it. Mark was also dealing with the Winklevoss lawsuit at the time, as well as another lawsuit not depicted in the movie. Another Harvard senior named Aaron Greenspan had accused Mark of stealing his idea for the Facebook, which he called House System, and he had released prior to Facebook. He would release a book called Authoritas, outlining all of the ways in which he thought not only Mark had stolen his idea, but also Divya and the Winklevoss twins as well, because he also sued them. Details on this are a little sparse, however, but if you are interested, Aaron himself gives a pretty good answer to the question on Quora, and I would suggest going and checking that out. In any event, he must have had a decent enough case because Facebook did end up settling with him for an undisclosed sum. In an effort to deal with some of the mounting issues and to keep Facebook running at the same pace, Mark cashed in his tuition money and kept the place afloat himself for the time being, but this would not be able to be sustained forever. This is where Sean Parker's experience in advising would prove to be invaluable, as he would help Mark navigate through the next couple of decisions that would need made to help to save the company. First, Sean would put Mark in touch with Peter Thiel the way he does in the movie. Thiel would later become a bit of a controversial character and somewhat of a liability for the company, but at this point he provided Mark with a couple of key things. One of them was the $500,000 angel investment we see depicted, but the other one was much more important. It would be Peter Thiel who would essentially show Mark the blueprint for how to fuck over Eduardo that I like to call carrot into a stick right to the face. This plan was hatched to dangle money in front of him in an effort to get him to sign the documents needed to restructure the company, which he did. This new structuring allowed for new shares to be issued and current stock diluted to accommodate these. But it is also due to some clever maneuvering from Parker that gave Mark control of 3 of the 5 seats on the board. This would ensure that Mark could never be voted out of his own company the same way that Parker was at Plaxo. Next, with the company newly incorporated, they would purchase the old Florida company, and Mark would have free reign to increase the number of shares to himself, Moskowitz, and Parker, and then dilute them from Eduardo over the next several months. With all of these things in place, Mark would assume full control of the company, having no longer to answer to anyone. And with how vital of a role he had played, it's not hard to see why he began referring to Sean as the president of the company by September of that year. Another critical thing Parker did was kill Wirehog dead in its tracks. Now, Mark had been arguably more excited about Wirehog than Facebook, so they clashed in terms of Parker's opinion on the project. Sean had been through the ringer through his ordeals with Napster and knew firsthand how ruthless the music industry could be. His worry was that Wirehog could face the same troubles that Napster did, and in turn would end up bringing Facebook down by proxy. Eventually, Mark began to see Sean's point of view, and Wirehog was eventually shelved, but not before pulling off one of the greatest pranks in Silicon Valley history, which is shown in the movie and I am pleased to say is 100% true. I'm talking of course about the pajama meeting between Mark and Mitchell Manningham and Case Equity. Now in reality this was done to Michael Moretz and Sequoia, and it was done as an act of revenge for Sean. The story goes Sequoia was very interested in investing in Facebook, but Mark had decided very early on he was never going to do business with Sequoia. However, at the behest of Parker, Mark did arrange a meeting to possibly invest in Wirehog. He really did show up 20 minutes late and in his pajamas, and unfortunately we don't get to see the actual scene of the presentation itself because word is it's very funny. Mark essentially proceeded to present a PowerPoint presentation of the top 10 reasons why they should not invest in Wirehog. Many of them started out innocent at first, however grew increasingly more cheeky, such as, we're not going to make any money and we're probably going to get sued by the music industry, and finally, because we're in business with Sean Parker.
Moretz was not impressed as is portrayed in the movie, and in reality he was incredibly pissed, but this didn't matter because Facebook would have no need for them and thus no fear of retaliation, as they had already made their decision to accept a large investment from Accel Partners. Anyway, it wasn't until spring 2005 before Eduardo noticed just how far he had been diluted down to, just below 10%, which I guess says something about how far detached from things he had become. This is captured in that awesome crescendo of the movie when Eduardo confronts Mark inside of Facebook's office. But in reality, unfortunately, this cathartic moment never happened, as only Eduardo and one of Facebook's lawyers were present at the meeting where he found out not only about what had happened to his shares, but also that he was being let go from the company. At this point, he would begin the lawsuit against Mark. The mediations and proceedings drug out for a while before Eduardo got the idea to contact Ben Mezrich for a tell-all book in an effort to force Mark to settle, which brings us full circle back to the events of the beginning of the movie. Now, since part of Eduardo's settlement was to not speak again to Ben Mezrich, the movie abruptly kind of ends and we are shown some explainers of what happened to everyone involved, while Mark waits for a friend request for approval from Erica, presumably so she can see what a successful computer person he has become. But this was made in 2010, and lots of shit has happened since then, so let's give an update to that. We'll start with Sean. So he really did get caught with coke and was forced to step away from the company in 2005. He would invest in Spotify in 2010 and would serve on their board of directors until 2017. He is now a philanthropist and venture capitalist. You became the thing you hated. The Winklevi did accept a settlement of $65 million as pointed out in the movie. However, they took it in Facebook stock. See, to them, part of this company and idea belonged to them and should be rightfully theirs, and this was a way to attain this. The twins would appeal this settlement later, however, after evidence of Mark's purposeful stonewalling came out. They also alleged that he deliberately undervalued the stock in the original settlement, believing that they should be owed closer to something like $200 million. However, they lost this appeal. The twins would found a venture capital firm in 2012 called Winklevoss Capital. They would invest in several projects, however, their first real success would come as some of the first people on the train during the initial Bitcoin explosion, becoming the first crypto billionaires. They founded a crypto exchange company called Gemini, which, hilariously enough, Mark would launch a competing project called Libra as well against them. Today, each of them is worth a reported $4 billion and are the subject of another Ben Mezrich book, The Bitcoin Billionaires, which is also being made into a movie. After Eduardo's settlement, he basically said, "Fuck y'all, I'm out," and took off to Singapore, renouncing his American citizenship in 2011. He's been living there ever since, working as an entrepreneur and an investor. The details of the money he made from the settlement were never released, but it's estimated he received about $5 billion, which, considering his initial investment of only $1,000, has to make him the most successful investor of all time, right? Finally, we come to Mark and the Facebook. Mark would continue turning down offers to sell the company, including a bid from Google to buy the company outright in 2006 for $1 billion, which I guess if he didn't think turning down $1 million in high school was cool, you know what is cool? Turning down $1 billion. Anyway, the gamble paid off because the next year in 2007, Facebook took a $250 million investment from Microsoft for just over 1% of the company. This officially valued them at $15 billion. Talk about knowing your worth. Mark would go on to become not only the youngest billionaire ever, as the movie points out, but also a pop culture icon and the center of constant controversy in the following years. I suspect we have not seen the last of him and his metaverse, or whatever. Facebook, despite being up against arguably a better product in MySpace, would go on to dethrone them at the top social networking site in 2008 after MySpace hit a brick wall in terms of growth and privacy issues, which I thought also was a bit of a missed opportunity by the movie, as not touching on what a true competitor MySpace was, because in all reality, Facebook should not have won the fight, and they were not always the heir apparent as portrayed in the movie. Overall, though, is this movie accurate to what happened in real life? Not really. But that doesn't at all take away from my enjoyment of it. A lot of the fault from this movie just happens to lie in the time that it was made, because since 2010, Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg have grown to become entirely different entities than they were at the time this movie was made. So much of the discussions that we would like to have today centering around censorship and the like are unfortunately not touched upon in this movie. However, I don't fault David Fincher and Aaron Sorkin for that, as really this movie should be more viewed as now of a period piece. The movie does manage to get a lot of things right also, such as some of the portrayals of the characters in terms of their personalities. For instance, the Winklevoss twins really are the men of Harvard that are portrayed in the movie. Jesse Eisenberg, while maybe turning it up to 11 a bit for the sake of the dialogue, really does nail the role of Mark Zuckerberg. So much so, in fact, that when I think of Mark Zuckerberg, Jesse Eisenberg's face is usually what pops in my head first. And apparently Justin Timberlake did such a good job of portraying Sean Parker that Sean Parker has begun to act more like Justin Timberlake's portrayal in the movie than he did before. The movie also raises some very interesting ethical questions, such as who really owns an idea if several people come up with the same one independent of one another, and how binding verbally made or handshake agreements really are. I hope also now that you see the parallels of the history of the internet's creation along with Facebook's. This massive idea that ended up being a Frankenstein's monster of several things different people brought to the table, but was ultimately put together by a visionary who saw all the pieces of the puzzle and created something world-changing, for better and for worse. This is where the paths diverge, however, in terms of how the participants will be remembered. For the creators of the internet, they have gone down already in history as pioneers and credits to society. For the creators of Facebook, it has, at least so far, been decidedly different. But all these guys ended up super rich and at least fairly successful, so I don't think it really matters to them. Above all, though, this movie succeeds at what Mark's main purpose always was for the Facebook, in that it is objectively and unabashedly
cool. It's cool and just cool.
Cool. You know what's cool? Hey, if you enjoyed the video, please do me a solid and like the subscribe button, share the bell thing, click on the thumbs up, do all the things. It helps with the algorithm.
The algorithm?
We also have, you guessed it, a Facebook page. You can be our friend there and we'll be super close buddies and hang out all the time. Probably not though. Also, what movie would you like to know the real story on? Let me know in the comments. Maybe I'll do it someday. That's all for now, folks. Until next time, be safe, be happy. Thanks for watching.
But remember, brother, keep it real.